we thank you for John's ministry. We thank you for the many years of study and wisdom and listening to you that he's had. And Father, we pray that you'd anoint him now by your Holy Spirit, that he would bring your heart to us now. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Thank you. Sorry. 1 Corinthians 13 from the Jerusalem Bible, a slightly different one from what you're used to, I expect. If I have all the eloquence of men or of angels, but speak without love, I'm simply a gong booming or a cymbal clashing. If I have the gift of prophecy, understanding all the mysteries there are, and knowing everything, and if I have faith in all its fullness to move mountains, but without love, then I'm nothing at all. If I give away all that I possess, piece by piece, and if I even let them take my body to burn it, but without love, it will do me no good whatever. Love is always patient and kind. Love is never jealous. Love is never boastful or conceited. It is never rude or selfish. It does not take offense and is not resentful. Love takes no pleasure in other people's sins, but delights in the truth. It is always ready to excuse, to trust, to hope, and to endure whatever comes. Love does not come to an end. But if there are gifts of prophecy, the time will come when they must fail. Or the gift of languages, it will not continue forever. And knowledge, for this too, the time will come when it must fail. For our knowledge is imperfect, and our prophesying is imperfect. But once perfection comes, all imperfect things will disappear. When I was a child, I used to talk like a child and think like a child and argue like a child. But now I'm a man. All childish ways are put behind me. Now we are seeing a dim reflection in a mirror. But then we shall see face to face. The knowledge that I have now is imperfect. But then I shall know as fully as I am known. In short, there are three things that last: faith, hope, and love. And the greatest of these is love. This is the word of the Lord. At many a wedding and not a few funerals, the reading chosen is 1 Corinthians 13. The reason being, of course, that many people see this chapter as a glorious hymn to love, a poem of immense beauty and joy, which celebrates the power of love. But as soon as you ask the question, what is 1 Corinthians 13 doing in the middle of 1 Corinthians 12 and 14, we realize that if we're going to be true to the whole letter, we cannot look at 13 in isolation from 12 and 14. For as has been said, a text without a context is a pretext. So tonight we're going to rescue 1 Corinthians 13 from the wedding service. Sorry to disappoint you, those who had it, but and we're going to put it in its context between, well, in fact, 11 and 14. It is then that we realize that the chapter is not so much a hymn to love as a kick up the proverbial to the Corinthian Christians who weren't being particularly loving. That's why it's here at this particular point. They had a tendency there to fall out with one another, as you've seen in previous weeks. So in chapters 11 and 12, as well as 14, Paul is dealing with a divisive issue in the Corinthian church: worship. As you can now see as we move to our next screen. 7 little essays there in these 3 chapters. The first and the last corresponding to each other. The second and the 6th. The third and the 5th. But there in the middle of these 7 little essays is this chapter on love. I owe this analysis to a great biblical scholar and Middle East expert who lived there for many years and died last year, Kenneth Bailey. As you can see, the so-called hymn to love is set in the centre of these 6 mini sermons on the theme of how worship should be conducted in Corinth in an atmosphere pervaded by love. Paul seems to have loved creating these patterns in his writing, starting a theme, moving on to 1 or 2 others, before returning with fresh insights into the point at which he started. So here's Kenneth Bailey's analysis of the poem on love. Again, 7 little sections. And the climax, sometimes in Paul, the climax comes in the middle, not at the end. The climax is there right in the middle. Love defined negatively. So again, 1 corresponds with 7, 2 with 6, 3 with 5, and then right in the middle, the negatives of love. Notice that love, the great theme of chapter 13, starts at the end of chapter 12 and doesn't really finish until the first verse of verse 14. So before we look at what Paul actually says, a word about love. The word he uses, as you know, is agape, and at the time it was not a very much used word, far less common than eros for erotic sexual love or phileo for brotherly love. It was a rather weak word until it came into the New Testament. It tended to be sort of the sense of I incline towards something, rather than lovingly embrace something. So I incline towards Mars bars rather than Twix might be a suitable place for it. But as of course we read the New Testament, we see that the New Testament writers, and Jesus, stemming from Jesus himself, of course, put an enormous zip into this concept of love. And it is sacrificial love, love that gives. And a lot of that was needed in the Corinthian church. You had to learn to love the person who ate and drank too much at the Eucharist before the slaves had arrived and were left with mere scraps. To love the person who's openly proud of their generosity, the person who gossips too much, the slave owner who has a lot to learn about what life must be like for someone who is his slave. And the slave who has to learn, well, what does it mean to be a slave now that I'm a Christian? You've got to learn to love the person who is so holy that they think it's a sin to burp. And also the person who has a long way to go before they take on board the radical difference that sexual ethics makes in the Christian's life. Love the person who boasts about eating food offered to idols. The woman whose husband has taken your husband to court over a business deal gone sour. The widow who is finding widowhood difficult and goes on and on and on about it. The young man whose attitude to young women in the congregation is powered only by eros and has little agape love about it. The person who doesn't speak in tongues has got to learn to love the person who thinks that operating in the gifts of the Spirit is the be-all and the end-all of church life. they both have to learn that love is not so much a higher gift, but rather the medium through which all the gifts are to be expressed. The person in the church who is steeped in Greek culture and philosophy has got to learn to love the person who has no GCSEs, but is loved by God just as much as they are. The person who works so very hard in the life of the church that they are developing something of a poor me martyr complex needs to learn to love the person who isn't, in their eyes anyway, pulling their weight. Each of these people need to be embraced by agape, for agape is love that gives, sacrificial love. Jesus put it like this, you'll remember: "My command is this, love each other as I have loved you. Greater love has no one than this, than that he lay down his life for his friends." John 15. Agape, of course, is one of the fruit of the Spirit, the first, to be followed by joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, faithfulness, and self-control. To be a person with a generous, loving, outgoing, sacrificial spirit is, for the New Testament writers, the height of a Christian's ambition. Paul concludes the section on love at 14 verse 1 with this: "You must want love more than anything else." That's the Jerusalem Bible's translation, and there's this from the more racy Message: "Go after a life of love as if your life depended on it, because it does." Love in the New Testament is not an abstract concept. No, it's very practical. Love gives. God so loved the world that he gave. All that by way of introduction. Now to the passage itself, and the first 3 verses of chapter 13. The primacy of love. Paul puts love in pole position as he describes 3 religious practices and how futile they are unless accompanied, embedded, and performed in love. You can be doing the right thing, but unless it flows out of a right heart attitude, it counts for very little in God's estimation. First of all, the speech without love. Mere noise. If I speak with the tongues of men and of angels, but have not love, I'm only a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal. The speech of men, that's normal human speech, common language. But asks Paul, what are the motives moving you when you speak? The speech of angels, presumably a reference to speaking in tongues, that God-given language used in praise when normal language seems inadequate, and used, if interpreted, to bring words of knowledge and prophecy. Great, says Paul, but great only if it's being used to bless, to encourage, to stir up delight in the Lord, and arises from a heart that's full of love for God and for his people. Resounding gongs made of brass, manufactured in Corinth. Perhaps Paul is referring to the brass horns that were sometimes used in open-air theatres so the actors could project their voices to those who were at the back and couldn't hear. Clanging cymbals may well have been used in pagan worship to excite, to stir up people. Paul is saying that even if you can speak with the heavenly language of angels, but have no love, your high-toned speech becomes like the empty echo of an actor's speech or the noise of frenzied pagan worship. Then there's intellectual and spiritual insights without love. Mere showing off, he says. There was a tendency in a number of New Testament churches for people who had drunk deeply at the well of Greek philosophy to believe that the Christian faith needed to be understood at two levels. One was for the ordinary folk, but the other was for people like them, who had the wit and the wisdom to perceive insights not open to mere mortals. Perhaps they believed they knew just how the world would come to an end, or even how many angels you could get on the head of a pin. Well, says Paul, you might have the intellectual standing of great theologians, people in the church like Aquinas and Calvin and Luther and Barth and Bonhoeffer. But God says, so what? Unless it's accompanied by love. Perhaps there were those who had such great faith that they believed that God could do miracles at the drop of a hat, or after they had prayed just one prayer very confidently. Well, says Paul, you might have the reputation for being a miracle worker, for building up great churches, being a pioneer missionary, but God says a sort of, so what? If that achievement is unaccompanied by love. The next category he picks up is activism without love. Mere gestures, he says. If I gave all I possess to the poor and surrender my body to the flames, but have not love, I gain nothing. That's an amazing statement from Paul. At the heart of what he's saying is this: these things, generosity, self-sacrifice, are extremely important. But just as the whole is greater than the part, so love is greater than these parts. Love must be the motivating force inspiring them, not self-glorification, not gaining a reputation. Paul is saying that whilst you may be a great Christian activist, 19th century Lord Shaftesbury, 20th century Martin Luther King, if your activism is resourced by pride, by recklessness, by fanaticism, then if that achievement is unaccompanied by love, God has his own sort of so what by it. The message then of this first section is this: gifts are dispensable, love is indispensable. Put mathematically, everything minus love equals nothing. That then was the primacy of love. Now we come to the portrait of love. Love doesn't exist in a vacuum. No, it exists in day-to-day real life. And day-to-day real life, as we know, is complicated. People are complicated. People are awkward. People are a nuisance. People don't think like I think. Why not? Well, they're God's people too, and learning to love them is part of the deal. Love's positives. Patience here has a sense of willingness to suffer a long time. Thus, love never gives up. Here's Lewis Smedes writing in his great book, Love Within Limits. Love is an uncommon power to cope with common suffering. In a world where suffering is almost a law of life, the power to suffer long may be one of life's most needed gifts. Long suffering is the power to be a creative victim. In loss of earnings, in a marriage struggling to keep the fires of love alive, in slowly or rapidly declining health, in bad treatment by family or friends, the Christian seeks to practice love. Love that has the ability to be creative, to forgive, to dream, to hope, to learn to grow in faith even when under pressure. Love is kind. It does good to those in need, those who are slow off the mark, those who are inept, even those who do harm. If patience has a negative fact about it, aspect to it, that is, not doing something, then kindness, of course, is the positive side of that, doing something. The 19th century German philosopher Nietzsche despised Christianity for its kindness. Wasting your time on handicapped people, lepers and the oppressed. Love, he said, weakened humanity. Get rid of love and become a super race of the strong. That was 19th century. 20th century, 1930s, we know where that sort of talk led. That doesn't mean that the love that is kind is always a pushover. There is such a thing as tough love, which needs to be shown when appropriate, perhaps to an addict, to a sport child, to a friend who's going off the rails, to the person who constantly exploits your goodwill. Reading Corinthians, we get a sense that Paul's love was on occasions very tough love, as he told them what to do with themselves on occasions. Love rejoices in the truth. Love takes pleasure in the flowering of the truth. Love encourages truthful speaking, honest, thought-out opinions. Then we get the four always. Always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres. Love always protects. That word protects seems to be a difficult one for the translators because a great variety of versions come out. The New Revised Standard Version has love bears all things. The Jerusalem Bible, love is always ready to excuse. The New English Bible, there is nothing love cannot face. Again, we get a picture of tough love. Love holding on in difficult circumstances and seeking to be a blessing. Love always trusts God. Thus it believes all things coming from the heart and the mind of God. Love is willing to trust people until perhaps they display their untrustworthiness. Its attitude to people is one of openness rather than cynicism, leading to suspicion. We live in a culture where cynicism and suspicion is, a common theme that's running through so much of the scandals that are uncovered. Pulling down this person, this group, that group. Not that it's undeserved always, but the trouble is creating a whole climate in which you feel you can hardly trust anyone. Love always seeks to trust. Love always hopes. Love hopes all things. Thus love is willing to give the offender a second chance. And as Jesus said to Peter, willing to forgive the erring brother an infinite number of times. Love always perseveres. It endures all things. Love copes with disappointment. Love prays for a bad situation to come good. Love that perseveres keeps going to the end. Love's positives. Then the heart of what Paul's saying, rather oddly in a way, is love's negatives. Right at the heart of Paul's description of love, this very relevant message to the warring factions in the church in Corinth. Love isn't jealous or envious. Love isn't obsessed with what it doesn't have. Love rejoices in the blessings that others have and gives them freedom to grow and to explore what they have been given. Agape love is not jealous because it lets go. it gives. It builds other people up. Love doesn't boast. It doesn't strut around as if it owns all it surveys. Love rejoices in the blessings that others have and gives them freedom to grow. It doesn't boast. As Paul said to the Philippians, do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit, but in humility consider others better than yourself. Writing this for the Corinthians, he's saying, your broad-mindedness, your intellectual superiority doesn't gel with the demands of love. Love isn't proud. Love lacks arrogance. Whereas arrogance asserts itself, love gives itself. When the arrogant get power, they so easily feel threatened by others, and so want more and more power in order to quieten the opposition. Love knows that at the end of the day, the humble ego is more content with the hand that God has dealt them than those who are inflated with self-congratulations. Love isn't rude. Love doesn't behave in an unseemly way. It doesn't force itself on others. Love doesn't put people down in order to build oneself up. Rudeness, I think, is a characteristic of people whose lives are somewhat empty. Whereas people who have the poise and the dignity inspired by love do not have to stoop to rudeness in order to make their voice heard. Love is never rude because love is the power that moves us towards people in order to bless them rather than to curse them. It is God's love that stabilizes us, and with that stability we learn to interact with other people. Love isn't self-seeking. Love doesn't insist on its own way. It doesn't have a me-first agenda. Christians know that they are loved, and a consequence of that is that they are more at home with themselves than people who do not know who they are or why they are. There is that ballast in the Christian life. We know who we are, we know why we are, and therefore we have freedom to operate in the realm of love. Those who love do not need to impose themselves on others. Love is not easily angered, not irritable, doesn't fly off the handle at the press of a button, not quick to take offence. Love keeps no record of wrongs, doesn't keep a score in a perpetual blame game. There's no file tucked away in the memory bank of grievances that can be consulted whenever there is a possibility of some new slight. That, of course, raises the problem of what love does with the evil that it encounters. Following Jesus' example, love takes on itself the anger and the injustices heaped upon it, thus diluting their power. Love, I think, is rather like a crash barrier. It absorbs the impact and then seeks to put the runaway vehicle back on track. Love doesn't delight in evil, never rejoices in the wrong. It doesn't gloat when others mess up big time. Love doesn't read the gutter press and feel smugly superior to those whose sordid lives are recorded there. Rather, as we saw earlier, it applauds the truth and rejoices in righteousness. So much for the things that love isn't. The permanence of love. In this section, Paul, at some length, says that love is not going away. Love cannot die because it is divine. The impermanence of the things of now. Three things: prophecies, tongues, and knowledge belong to time. But love originates in eternity, enters our time, and continues into all time to come. Prophecies will cease, because that which they looked forward to will have arrived. The future will have happened. Tongues will cease, because the ecstatic speech experienced on earth will be as nothing compared to the worship in heaven. Paul would, of course, say, if he were here, if you do speak in tongues, that's great. There's no reason why you shouldn't now be practicing the language of heaven, a mind-bending language of praise and adoration. Knowledge will pass away. Not really sure what sort of knowledge Paul had in mind. Possibly intellectual knowledge of the world and how it works. If people like Pythagoras and Archimedes had heard this, they would, of course, howled in pain. For them, the accumulation of knowledge of how the world works was the pinnacle of human achievement. So what Paul could be saying is this: your O-levels, your A-levels, your degrees, your higher degrees are as nothing compared to seeing the created order from the other side, from God's side. Possibly he had superior spiritual knowledge in mind, the sort of thing the Gnostics claim to have. So he's saying what they claim is as nothing compared to the understanding of heavenly things that they will have one day. Who needs the lights on when the sun comes out? Knowledge will pass away when full knowledge in the blazing glory of the sun arrives. The partial nature of the things of now. Now we know a portion of the truth, and what we see about God is always partial. Now we prophesy only a little of that which is to be, but one day. Just as we look back on the things we believed and the ways we reasoned when we were children, well, I was very young then, and I didn't know any better when I believed in Father Christmas. You grow out of certain things, fairies and tooth. Similarly for us as Christians now, we have a certain degree of knowledge, certain amount of experience. One day, though, even that will seem rather childish compared to that which we shall experience. I was very young then. I didn't know any better. Mirrors were made in Corinth, not of glass, but of polished metal. The more highly polished, expensive ones gave a better image than cheaper versions. They gave a poor, dim reflection. And from that sense of that word, we get the word enigma, something that's mysterious. We don't see it clearly. Paul is once again telling the Corinthians not to be so proud of their spiritual gifts, because one day they will come to realize that they only partially reflect God's reality. The permanence of the things of God's future. Many things are not permanent, especially things cherished by the Corinthian Christians. But love, he says, is permanent. Many things are known in part, but love is the real deal, the full works. So Paul writes about the permanent things in God's future. Love that never fails. Love cannot be defeated because love is divine. It never comes to an end because it is eternal. Many waters cannot quench love, says the Song of Solomon. Love is the currency that is much more permanent than Bitcoin. Perfection that drives out imperfection. Another word here used, another translation for the word perfection is the complete. When the complete comes, there is nothing more to be added. Love, however, is embedded in that perfection, that which is complete. Mature adulthood supplants immaturity. The flip side of an immature childhood is mature adulthood. And that is what you're headed for by faith, he says. When I became a man, I put away childish things. Face-to-face encounters that replace long-distance telephone calls. Or if that one doesn't grab you, high-definition wide screens replacing a 1950s black and white fuzzy TV. The truth is that now we know something of God, whilst God knows us fully. There will come a time, though, when we have a direct encounter with God. One day we shall see it all as clearly as God now sees us. One day we shall know fully, even as God fully knows us. Love takes pride of place. And now these three things remain: faith, hope, and love. But the greatest of these is love. Follow the way of love. Why is love the greatest of these three? One answer is that God doesn't need, in a sense, to have faith or hope because he is in control. But he does need love, because without his love, creation and his creatures are lost. Another answer, and one the Christians needed to hear, is this: it is love which most makes the church look like heaven. This is a preparation in our fellowship for that which is to be. I probably said this before, but one of the things I experienced going around churches in this country and in Europe is that somehow God has stamped people with his grace. You don't all go around wearing a sort of as if you've been stamped with ink on your foreheads, but it is there. And the truth is that I reckon I could pick out a group of Christians from a group of people of similar ages, similar looks. Why? Because some of the worry lines, some of the bitterness, some of the hard-heartedness will have been erased from their faces. God's people do not look like other people, and in that we can rejoice. So the church, characterized by love, is our preparation for heaven. I want to end with a quote from Richard Niebuhr, or it may be his brother Reinhold, I'm not sure which. They were both great theologians from the last century. Nothing that is worth doing can be achieved in our time, therefore we must be saved by heaven. Nothing which is true or beautiful or good makes complete sense in any immediate context of history, therefore we must be saved by faith. Nothing we do, however virtuous, can be accomplished alone, therefore we must be saved by love. We're going to end with a song in a moment, not this one. I'm going to leave each verse on for 10 seconds, and then as you read the verse, make it into a prayer.